Hey, did you know that in 1892 a group of villagers in Rhode Island dug up the body of a young woman because they believed she was a vampire? It probably sounds like something out of a fever dream, but it really happened. In the dead of winter, in the small town of Exeter, a crowd gathered in a cemetery. The ground was frozen solid, but that didn't stop them. They began digging. And beneath that frozen dirt lay a coffin. And when the lid was lifted, the people standing around the grave reportedly gasped. The body inside looked strangely preserved, and to the frightened townspeople watching, there was only one explanation. They believed that the corpse was actually a vampire, draining the life from her family. But the real story behind what happened that night isn't about monsters or the undead. It's about fear, disease, in a time when people were so desperate for answers that they turned to the supernatural. This is the story of Mercy Brown, the last American vampire. Welcome everybody back to another episode of Hey Did You Know, where we dig up the weird, the forgotten, and the downright strange corners of America. Thank you all for being here for another episode. Quick reminder before we get started, make sure you're following, make sure you like, make sure you subscribe, and hit the bell, whatever you have to do to make sure that you don't miss an episode, because we drop new stories every Wednesday. And don't forget to leave a comment with your thoughts, because I love hearing what you think of the episode. And I might even feature it in a future one. But for now, let's rewind back to the 1800s. Picture it, Exeter, Rhode Island in the 1880s, a small, quiet farming town in New England. The kind of place where everybody knows everybody, where families had lived on the same land for generations. But something was moving through towns like this, something slow, something patient, and something merciless. It was called consumption. What we know today as tuberculosis. But doctors in the 19th century didn't fully understand what caused it or how it spread. What they did know was what it looked like. And it was ugly. A persistent cough that never went away, extreme weight loss, skin that turned as pale as paper, and eventually, death. The disease moved slowly and cruelly, sometimes taking months, sometimes years, to finish exactly what it started. And the thing that frightened people the most? It seemed to follow families. One person would fall ill, then another, as if something invisible was moving from room to room, feeding on the people inside. And without modern medicine to explain it, communities reached for the only explanations that they had: old stories, old fears, and folklore carried over from Europe, passed down generations and generations. Some began to whisper that the dead weren't staying dead, that someone in the grave was reaching back and pulling down the living. The fear became something that the historians now call the New England vampire panic. And inside that panic, that's where our story starts. The winter of 1883 was when it started. That December, Mary Eliza, Mercy's mother, became the first in the family to die of consumption. She was gone before the new year. And in the spring of the following year, Mercy's older sister, Mary Olive, a 23-year-old dressmaker, began to show the same symptoms. Month by month, she faded, and by June of 1884, she was gone too. 2 deaths, less than a year apart. George Brown, the father of Mercy, buried his wife and his daughter and tried to hold what was left of his family together. And for a few years, life returned to something close to normal. And then, in 1889, his son Edwin got sick. The same cough, the same weight loss, the same slow grinding decline. And doctors had little to nothing to offer. But one suggestion kept coming up: go west, Colorado Springs specifically, where the dry mountain air was believed to help tuberculosis patients breathe easier. And Edwin decided to take his wife and make the trip. And for a while, Colorado seemed to help him, as his condition stabilized and maybe even improved. Out there in the mountain air, 1,000 miles from Exeter, it must have felt like the worst was all behind him. But it wasn't. Because back home, quietly and quickly without warning, Mercy got sick. And unlike the others, Mercy didn't have time to slowly fade. She had what doctors called galloping consumption, which is a form of tuberculosis that could hide in the body for years and then move with terrifying speed once it took hold. On January 17th, 1892, Mercy Brown died, and when her brother Edwin heard the news, he immediately rushed back home. Unfortunately, that was probably the wrong decision, for his health at least, because whatever progress he had made in Colorado collapsed almost immediately. His fever returned and his body weakened, and as he lay in bed drifting in and out of consciousness, he began to say things frightening the people around him. He'd whisper that he could see her, and that she came to him at night. "She's here," he would say. "She wants me to come with her." Neighbors had watched the Brown family suffer for nearly a decade. They began to whisper among themselves that they had heard stories, old stories, about families just like this one, where the dead seemed to follow the living into the grave. They went to George Brown with their suspicions. George didn't believe any of it. He had just buried his daughter, and the last thing that he wanted to do was dig her back up. He refused. But Edwin kept getting worse, and the neighbors kept coming back. And eventually, the exhausted and grieving and out of options George relented. On March 17th, 1892, a small crowd gathered at Chestnut Hill Cemetery. The local medical examiner, Dr. Harold Metcalf, was there, not because he believed in vampires, but because someone had to make this official. They opened the graves of Mary Eliza and Mary Olive first. What they found was exactly what you'd expect: skeletal remains, women who had been dead for years. And then they turned to Mercy. And when they opened her coffin, the crowd went quiet. Her body had not decomposed the way they expected. Her features were still recognizable, and when Dr. Metcalf examined her more closely, he found something that sent a murmur through the crowd. There was still blood in her heart. Now, here's something that the townspeople may not have fully considered. Mercy had died in January, in the middle of a New England winter, when the ground was too frozen to even dig up. Her body had been placed in a stone crypt above ground, exposed to the cold, waiting for the ground to thaw. She'd only been dead for 2 months, and she had been kept in near freezing temperatures the entire time. To anyone who understands science, like Dr. Metcalf did, the explanation was simple. Slow temperatures, slow decomposition. 2 months in a freezing crypt was more than enough to explain what they were seeing. But Metcalf was one man, and the crowd around him had not come for biology. To them, this was proof. And according to the folklore, there were several ways to stop this, what they believed to be a vampire attack. And in this case, the method they chose was to destroy the organs that appeared to be fresh. So, Mercy's heart and liver were removed and burned on a nearby rock. The ashes were then mixed with water and given to Edwin to drink, a tonic that the old folklore promised would break the vampire's hold on the family. Of course, Edwin drank it. And on May 2nd, 1892, less than 2 months later, he died anyway. 4 members of the Brown family gone, 1 disease, and 1 grieving father left behind. In the end, George Brown never contracted tuberculosis. He outlived his wife, his daughters, and now his son. He lived until 1922, long enough to see the world change in ways that he probably couldn't have imagined when he was burying his family in the frozen ground of Exeter. The year before he died, scientists finally developed the BCG vaccine, the first real weapon against the disease that came decades too late for the people buried in Chestnut Hill Cemetery, but one that would go on to save millions of lives around the world. The case of Mercy Brown wasn't unique. Not entirely, at least, because according to author Diana Ross McCain, there were at least 18 documented cases across New England in the 18th and 19th centuries, where families exhumed their dead during suspected vampire outbreaks. Desperate people doing desperate things, trying to make sense of a disease that seemed to defy explanation. But Mercy's case ended up being the last. Maybe because science finally caught up, or maybe because panic ran out of fuel, or maybe because something about Mercy's story, a 19-year-old girl dug up in the winter, her heart burned on a rock while her brother lay dying, was too much, even enough for the frightened people of the town of Exeter. Her grave is still there, in Chestnut Hill Cemetery in Exeter, Rhode Island, a small plot between a modest white church. More than 130 years later, people still visit. They leave flowers, sometimes coins, little tokens for a girl who became a legend without ever asking to be one. In a time of panic, people reach for whatever explanation feels like control. So I leave you with this question. If you had lived in Exeter in 1892, would you have believed the rumors? Would you have been standing in the cemetery, or would you have been more like George, refusing to believe until there was nothing left to do? And here's something else that I really just thought about while I was asking that question. George Brown never got sick. Not once. So what if the folklore had it backwards? What if the tonic wasn't meant to save the dying, but it was actually made to protect the living? Could it be that whatever was in those ashes really worked, just not in the way anyone expected? Let me know. Tell me in the comments. Let me know your thoughts. But for now, I want to say thank you so much for listening to this story. And if you've enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend. And don't forget to follow so that you don't miss the next one. Because next time, we're leaving New England and heading down to the streets of New Orleans in the early 1900s. Because a figure there was moving through the night. Broken doors, brutal attacks, and a letter delivered to a local newspaper that the city would never forget. They called him the Axeman. Until next time, thank you for listening.